All right. Speaking of Islam, I was listening to Sam Harris's Waking Up podcast. I've been putting it on the back burner, but I was actually going to do a kind of top 10 list of things I actually like that are either, religious in nature or associated with religion. And one of them was going to be the poetry of Jalaluddin Rumi. And a lot of you out there probably already know who Rumi is. He's a Sufi Muslim poet from the Middle Ages, known for the really kind of beautiful and ecstatic and mystical nature of his poetry. And Sam Harris is a fan too. And it was just kind of an interesting change to hear. Sam Harris was actually talking about stuff he likes about Islam, the call to prayer, the poetry of Rumi, stuff like that. So I think I'll play that clip for you now. And Sam's guest, by the way, is Eric Weinstein. And just a heads up, this clip is about 8 or 9 minutes long, another long clip, similar to last week's with John Hodgman and Pete Holmes. But in fairness, the original is over 2 hours, and you can find the original, of course, by going to iTunes or anywhere else where Sam Harris's podcast, Waking Up, is available.
So, for instance, your jihadi sandbox, I also have that jihadi sandbox, and I have a blog post that I've referenced a few times on the podcast entitled Islam and the Misuses of Ecstasy, where I try to describe in a series of embedded videos just how deep my sympathy with the surface features of Muslim religion and spirituality runs. And, I think the call to prayer is one of the most beautiful things ever to appear on earth. I love the sound of it.
I love the sound of it.
Yeah. And there's a great one that I linked to in that blog post. And I love Qawwali music, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, the Pakistani
Saw him
singer.
in Boston.
Yeah.
What a show.
Oh, yeah. That's unfortunately I never got a chance to do that. And I love the poetry of Rumi, and I even get what the
you talked about this on any of your shows?
Not at length, but I've
so this I wanted to come
yeah.
down here and talk to you about this in particular,
Sure.
because I think one of the things that's going on is that you do not spend enough time talking about all of the fantastic contributions of this culture, and you point in one case at the really appalling lack of scientific achievements of Muslims, let's say, since the Nobel Prize has been given out. I think there have been 3 in the sciences, and one of them was to the great Ahmadi Muslim who contributed to the standard model of physics. So he would be considered not a Muslim in Pakistan.
Right.
But I think one of the problems is you're not advertising the emotional valence that I've secretly suspected you must have. So, when I struggle with this, I have a friend group that is disproportionately Islamic, and it's been one of the great experiences of my life since I was 16. My closest friend, welcomed me into his family, his culture. It was a completely eye-opening experience. And
this is a friend from high school, or
a friend from college, and he, his family engaged in traditional practices with the hand kissing and touching feet and all sorts of, or I guess the feet touching was a different kind of field of respect, but the family was so courageous. I mean, his sister was brutally gang raped in India, and the father supported his daughter, talking about it openly, when you would imagine that the feelings of shame and the issues of honor would have been dominant. And so in my life, I have traveled always openly as a Jew in the Islamic world, and I've been treated incredibly well. I believe that if the Nazis were ever to recur, the floorboards under which I would be hidden would likely be Muslim floorboards. So it's very painful to not have this long, short language where, in general, I've been in a largely Islamic social context since I was 16. People don't ever address you as "Oh, Crusader." That kind of speech that you get used to watching ISIS videos, which most people don't watch, but I've watched a great deal of them just because I need to know about this. You're talking about two completely different worlds that are connected. And I think it's really important to advertise more heart, more empathy, more emotion, because otherwise the very dry analytic way in which you go about thinking about this, I think gets too much play in a certain sense. You are so logical that the fact that the texts say these very clear things, or that there's ambiguity, but there's a hierarchy for resolving the ambiguities, this appeals to your analytic mind. And I think both you and I have an analytic bent, and we would be much more tempted, were we highly religious, to go down these sort of, well, it says here in the text that this is true, and if I really believe this is the infallible word of the Creator, and that I'm going against God not to follow directions, we would be tempted by that interpretation. And so I think in part, it's a little bit perverse that you almost have more sympathies with the literal versions of the religion than you do with what you call, and I think it's somewhat disparaging, nominal members of these religions. This lines up with what Majid Nawaz talks about multiple interpretations are the beginning of de-radicalization. And I think what you struggle with a lot is that you're very sympathetic to the literal, and you're much less sympathetic to the doped with nonsense, or, clearly our Judaism in the modern era is doped with Christianity, which I think is a pretty good thing. If it goes too far, I get very alienated. But I think it's important to realize that the nominal versions of these religions are in some sense the true versions of these religions within the civilized modern era. And the literal attempts to go back to, 6th century or some thousands of years before Christ are, this is nonsense.
So to rewind all the way to the point of my not expressing my sympathy with the liturgy and iconography and spirituality and
food, architecture, music.
Of these cultures enough. I guess the way I have decided to go long short there is not so much focusing on those features, although I have a little bit, but more to point out that my real sympathy and solidarity is with the people who are suffering most under theocracy. And those are, in this case, actual other Muslims who are not disposed to live under theocracy. So it's liberal Muslims, it's Muslim women, it's apostates, it's freethinkers. And, I try to come around, if I don't do it in every paragraph, I try, without letting too many minutes elapse on the clock, to come around to the point, just the stark acknowledgement that obviously no one suffers the consequences of global jihadism and Islamist theocracy more than Muslims do. And it's the Muslims I hear from, the ex-Muslims and the liberal Muslims, who I am always thinking about, in addition to worrying about the civilizational consequences of jihadism. And I'm also aware that my sympathy with spiritual aspiration and spiritual experience, my finding something intelligible in the poetry of Rumi, doesn't survive collision with the doubts in the brains of much of my audience. I speak to atheists and secularists who have no idea what I'm talking about when I talk about meditation, and they certainly have no idea what Rumi's talking about, and many of them don't want to know. And so there's it's not, I'm not censoring myself on the basis of that, but it's just Rumi's not so interesting to much of my audience, or at least hasn't been thus far. The other reason why I focus on literalism is because I think there's an asymmetry here and a real advantage to the literalists, and I don't know how we ever get out from under this thing, because the issue for me is that there is a more and less plausible reading of any scripture, right. And this is what I ran into with Majid in our conversation together. So the implausible readings don't survive very well because they are in fact implausible. You can't really read any of these traditions, to speak of the Abrahamic ones, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You can't read any of their scripture and get as a plausible reading the value that homosexuality is just as good, ethically speaking, as heterosexuality, or that women are and must be the political equals and the moral equals to men, right? So it's what you have to do is you have to bring those modern values to the text and cherry pick and leverage in ways that is a bit of a pantomime of scholarship. It's not really. I mean, you know what you want the answer to be in advance, right?
Right.
It's not like you're discovering those values in the text, because actually the antithesis is in the text. I mean, wherever those topics are touched, for the most part, it's certainly clearest on the case of homosexuality. It's anathema, right? So it's it's anathema in the Hebrew Bible. It's anathema in St. Paul. It's certainly the anathema in the Quran and the Hadith.
Yeah, so I thought that was pretty interesting. And one of the things that first really drew me to Sam Harris was the fact that, like myself, he is an atheist who has quote unquote spiritual interests, meditation, sacred music, Eastern philosophy, stuff like that. And yet, because he has such a stoic, sometimes almost, so analytical, he almost comes off as robotic kind of demeanor. I think some people aren't aware of that side of him.